I remember something that I forgot. When it comes to a wastegate, any wastegate would be external or internal. If your spring pressure is 10 pounds, you can never run less than 10 pounds of boost. Unless, of course, the exhaust pressure pre-wastegate happens to be higher than the 10-pound reference mark. And so if you have a system where you have a 10-pound spring in it and you're getting 12 pounds at zero wastegate duty cycle, and that means that your system is actually pretty efficient. That means that your exhaust pressure is less than 10 pounds when your boost pressure is 10 psi. And so you have a more efficient setup at that area, which is actually good news because that means that as you start cranking the boost up, the engine will perform better. If you have one where you got 10 psi spring that's making 8 pounds or less, then your system is less efficient because you have higher back pressure at that point. So it's going to limit the power you make, up top. The other thing is, in a MAF-controlled car, it doesn't matter if you're at 20 psi, 20% TPS or 100% TPS. Doesn't matter if your target boost is 0 or your target boost is 50. If you're running 10 pounds of boost in the manifold, then chances are your air and fuel target is going to be fine for your tune at 10 pounds. The only exception to that would be is that when you have a throttle plate that is partially closed, the pressure that it takes to get 10 pounds in the manifold, you're going to have like 15 pounds in the intercooler piping before the throttle body. And that there will also equate to more exhaust pressure needed to drive the turbo to create that higher boost. So in that case, it's possible that if you are higher than your target boost that you tuned it for, that you could have some issues with maybe detonation or something like that. Fueling, though, should stay on point if it is a MAF-controlled car. If it's a speed density car, then you could very well have an issue because your back pressure is actually exceeding what it would be if you were at 10 psi on a full open throttle. So that could be a concern. A lot of ECUs have the ability to monitor exhaust gas back pressure, not factory tunes, factory ones, but a lot of aftermarket ones have the ability to monitor the exhaust gas back pressure and then adjust the tune based on that. I recently bought an Adaptronic from Andy Wyatt and his crew. It has both a MAP port and an exhaust or EMAP port on it, so I can route that pressure signal to the ECU and use it as needed to adjust the tune. So 10 pounds at half throttle and 10 pounds at full throttle, the ECU will know that when the exhaust gas pressure is higher at half throttle, then I am able to adjust the tune appropriately for that because of the extra back pressure. Also, manual boost controllers, in my opinion, on a daily driven car that has a modern ECU, like in a Subaru, for example, should never be used. There's almost no point anymore to them. You can easily control boost using a 3-port or a 2-port or whatever. As long as you choose the right stuff, the right parts, then it is very easy to control boost on a car. If you use too high of a spring pressure, then you can run into issues where your wastegate duty cycle is too low, and when it's too low, you lose resolution. And what I mean by that, and I think it's very important, is resolution. People often sell a 3-port wastegate duty cycle, 3-port wastegate boost control solenoid, and tell you that it lowers wastegate duty cycle by 50%. Well, I don't see that as an advantage in any way, unless, of course, you were already maxed out and you were unable to hit your boost targets. Then that could potentially be an advantage. But really, all that's telling you is that you're losing 50% of your resolution. And what that means is you end up having a boost control system that is very sensitive to changes in interior temperature, very sensitive to changes in heat, exhaust pressure, altitude, anything. And the last thing you want is a super sensitive boost control system. That doesn't make any sense to me. A manual is only a little sensitive to those things. However, what it does do is it removes the ECU's ability to protect the engine in the case of knock. On the Subarus, they have the ability, if the knock is excessive, to lower the boost, or actually to turn off the boost control solenoid, and therefore lower the boost down to wastegate pressure in an attempt to save the engine. And I think that's a good feature to keep. I don't know why anyone would want to get rid of that. So my personal philosophy is on a boost control system is, if it's a daily driven car, I try and keep the spring pressure around 10 psi. Factory is 7 to 9 based on which turbo you have. I try and keep around 10 psi on most aftermarket cars, or turbo systems in most cars. that gives it the ECU the ability to both lower the boost in the event of excessive knock, but it also provides the tuner with some resolution on it. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is if I have a system with a really high spring and I start adding some wastegate duty cycle to it, I may find myself in a situation where 5% wastegate duty cycle gives me, 8 psi. That's a lot. That is a big return on investment per se. But what that also means is that as temperature changes, right, I don't have a whole lot of percent to mess with. The ECU reports wastegate duty cycles in either whole numbers or in half percents. It does it, even though if you look at the boost control tables, it'll say the error, you can have a 0.20 for a boost error of -1, 0.4 pounds or whatever. So that's great. But the ECU is not giving you a duty cycle on the solenoid out the 2 decimal places. It just isn't doing that. It's going to use these numbers and it's going to round some. And so what happens is you have a system that is so sensitive that even though you have these tiny numbers in here, you still can't accurately control boost levels. And so what I'm looking for is a system where 5% duty cycle only gives me, like maybe 2 psi, right? I only want a few pounds. And if you think about it, if my wastegate pressure is 19 psi, and I have a system that gives me 8 psi for 5%, I only need to use 10% to add 16 to that. Well, that's 35 psi. I don't think I want to have 35 psi of boost on only 10% wastegate duty cycle. It doesn't make sense. But I've seen that multiple times. I have many cars that show up with way high springs in there that end up giving me this kind of boost control. And I tell the people, like, look, there's only so much you can do. It gets too cold outside, this becomes 12 psi for 5%. And the ECU just doesn't have the resolution to control it. What I want to see is a very low value, for a chunk of wastegate duty cycle, like I said, about 5. So then if I want to say I want to hit 30 psi, well then I would need 15% to hit 30 psi. Where on this setup, I would need, 7, 8%? Not very much, right? So I want to have more resolution, more ability, more steps in between, fine control over the boost. And so what I try and target is a spring pressure that gives me full target boost around 65 to 75% duty cycle. That means I have many steps between full boost and spring pressure, which means I have much better control through temperature ranges, intake air temp, outside air temp, atmospheric pressure, heck, even the amount of heat that's retained in the header is going to affect the boost control. So, and it will change from gear to gear, it'll change from pole to pole, it'll change with outside air conditioning. So I want to have the most control over. So like I said, my philosophy is 65 to 75% wastegate duty cycle at full boost. That's what I want to see. Now, it doesn't always happen. Right? Sometimes it's a little hard to get, and I'm usually finding that a lot of the daily driven cars with 10-pound springs in them on a .15 or a VF, they're usually around the 50 to 60 range, which still works out really pretty well. I mean, that's still a pretty good resolution. But when I get a customer's car in and I put 15% duty cycle on it and the car's 40 psi, it's like, I don't know what to tell you, man. I can put it down to 5, but that only gives me 5%, from wastegate pressure to 40 psi. That means I just don't have a whole lot of steps in there. Every 1% duty cycle, is going to be a 5-pound change, and that's just uncontrollable. That's completely uncontrollable. There's nothing you can do about that. And you're like, all right, well, so this is what you get, and that's no good. So it's best to run the lightest spring that you can get away with to maintain your duty cyclist range, so you have the most fine boost control. Now that's not a daily driven car. That's going to be on pump gas. Pump gas is very volatile. It's the standards from one station to the other. The control isn't as good. It sits a little longer and take in one place versus another, and it might have lower octane, right? There's a lot of issues that could be had on pump gas. And the race gas, hey, a few extra PSI on race gas, it's no big freaking deal. As long as it's tuned right and you have enough fuel on the motor, so what? So some guys are like, I don't give a shit if it's 10%, that's fine. If you're shooting for high boost levels, that's great, but most of my customers drive their cars every day, and most of my customers put pump gas in their cars, and most of my customers have Subarus that they don't want to separate the heads from. The turbocharger's job is to take the heads and push them off of the block. And I want to prevent that from happening, so I do my best to keep them attached, and having good boost control especially on pump gas, is really important for that. So again, I say that's my standard, and it usually is anywhere from 8 to a 12-pound spring. In my own personal car, I have a big turbo. I have 2 wastegates. I got 2 12-pound springs in mine. I have no problem hitting 40 pounds of boost on it. No problem on an EFR. And I don't need to have a 19-pound spring. I like having the control. I also like having partial throttle boost control. To me, as a road racer, when I come out of a turn, I want to have control over the car. If I give it 50% throttle, I want 50% power. If I give it 75% throttle, I want 75% power. I don't want to have a car that's trying to give me 19, 20 pounds of boost at 30% throttle. That's not controllable. And that's an easy way of upsetting the chassis and spinning the car out on exit of a turn. So it doesn't make sense to me. It makes sense that when my throttle is full to the floor, that's all the power I want. And so for me to get that and have those steps in between, that resolution like I was talking about, just like with boost control, my power should have, TPS to horsepower, right? I want the same kind of effect. If I have half throttle, I want about half power. And any road racer that wants a nice flat torque curve, they want to have a predictable, car on the throttle and have the ability to modulate the throttle and get a varying level of power. And you can't do that with a 19 or 20 psi spring. It just doesn't happen. So it's really important to me to run the lowest spring possible to get you this range and still be able to spool the turbo up in a reasonable amount of time. I hope that helps. I'm not thinking about this time.